God wanted to, he could make his existence very obvious. He could use a booming voice to tell every person alive that he exists and that Christianity is true. But that doesn't happen. Or at the very least, it doesn't happen a lot. Now, this would require zero effort from God, and God is perfectly loving. So it seems that God actually doesn't want to make his existence 100% totally obvious. So maybe theists should adopt what I call the intentional hiddenness thesis. What if God wants a specific level of evidence for his existence, which is neither too high nor too low? This thesis might be more plausible than it sounds at first. If the evidence for God's existence was too low, then theism would be irrational. However, if the evidence for God's existence was too high, then that might result in the loss of certain greater goods. What exactly these greater goods will look like will be fairly dependent on one's theology. But here are some possibilities. Wrestling with doubts may improve one's character or one's relationship with God. Also, if one was certain that they would be rewarded for every good act, as a perfect being would surely do, it might be psychologically difficult to act selflessly rather than on the selfish desire for reward. So in between the two evidential extremes, there'd be a Goldilocks zone of evidence for God's existence which brings about the most good. Thus, the intentional hiddenness thesis predicts that God would actually try to keep the level of evidence for his existence within this zone, and intervene if it ever got too high or too low. Now, actually seeing if this has happened globally throughout all of history would require some complex historical analysis that I lack the credentials to perform. However, we can see some examples of this. Design arguments from biology used to be more popular, but that changed after the advent of modern evolutionary theory. But, not long after that, scientific advancements in cosmology established both the fine-tuning of the physical constants of our universe, as well as the Big Bang Theory, which helps cosmological arguments. If this kind of back and forth is representative of broader history, then that looks suspiciously like God is intentionally keeping the level of evidence for his existence within a particular range. So, the fact that God's existence stays within that range would be evidence for his existence. Now, this argument has some interesting implications. If, after complex historical analysis, this argument bears out, then that would raise the probability that God exists. However, if this argument bears out, that would mean God would intentionally counteract that evidential boost this argument yields to keep the evidence in the Goldilocks zone. But if that happens, then we get even more evidence that my argument works. So the probability of God's existence would go up, which would then require maybe another intervention from God, or maybe God wouldn't counteract this argument because then the fact that it wasn't counteracted would falsify this argument's predictions, thus invalidating its evidential support. But this argument's evidential support being invalidated would be expected by this argument, so that validates the argument. But now both this argument's being validated and invalidated are both expected, making neither expected, which means that the argument wouldn't be validated, which is expected given the argument, and thus raises the... Okay, sorry. I'm getting dizzy. I need to lie down. Just